What hurts a woman the most when she never truly valued you? Most men think it's revenge. They think it's finding someone new. They think it's making her jealous, posting photos, showing off success, or proving she made a mistake. But according to Stoic wisdom, the deepest pain isn't caused by what you do to her. It's caused by what you stop doing for her. And that's where almost every man gets it wrong. Because when you've invested your time, your energy, your loyalty, and your heart into someone who barely appreciated it, your first instinct is to fight harder, to explain yourself, to defend your intentions, to make her understand what she lost. But Marcus Aurelius warned against this kind of struggle centuries ago. He understood something most people never learn. The moment you need someone else's validation to feel valuable, you've already handed them power over your peace. And power given away is rarely returned willingly. So today we're talking about the one thing that unsettles a woman more than arguments, more than anger, and more than emotional reactions. It is the moment a man becomes emotionally free. Not cold, not bitter, not cruel. Free. Because nothing confuses someone more than realizing the person they thought would always be there has finally stopped needing their approval. At first, she doesn't notice. Why would she? For so long, the pattern never changed. You were always available, always understanding, always willing to have another conversation, always willing to give another chance. When she pulled away, you moved closer. When she became distant, you became patient. When she gave less, you gave more. You convinced yourself that loyalty meant enduring anything. That love meant tolerating disrespect. That commitment meant staying no matter what. And little by little, something dangerous happened. Your consistency became invisible. Your effort became expected. Your presence became assumed. The very things that once made you valuable became things she stopped noticing. Because human nature often overlooks what it receives without effort. The sun rises every morning. Most people never stop to appreciate it. The same thing happens in relationships. When someone believes you'll never leave, they stop treating your presence like a privilege. It becomes a certainty. And certainty often destroys appreciation. She may not have done it consciously. Most people don't. But she became comfortable. Comfortable knowing you would stay. Comfortable knowing you would forgive. Comfortable knowing you would return. No matter how many times she withdrew her energy. No matter how many times she left you questioning where you stood. No matter how many times she made you feel like an option instead of a priority. She believed the pattern would continue. Forever. Then one day, it didn't. Not because you found someone else. Not because you decided to punish her. Not because you suddenly became heartless. Because you became tired. Not physically tired. Spiritually tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying a relationship by yourself for too long. The kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly proving your worth to someone who never stopped questioning it. The kind of exhaustion that comes from giving your best to a person who treated it like the minimum. And when that realization finally arrived, something inside you changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, quietly. You stopped chasing conversations that went nowhere. You stopped trying to decode mixed signals. You stopped turning silence into essays. You stopped begging for clarity from someone who benefited from keeping you confused. You simply stepped back. And that's when the balance of power shifted. Because the strongest move a man can make is often the one nobody notices immediately. The decision to withdraw his energy. Not out of anger. Out of self-respect. Most people expect resistance. They know how to respond to arguments. They know how to respond to accusations. They know how to respond to emotional reactions. What they don't know how to respond to is peace. Real peace. The kind of peace that no longer needs explanations. The kind of peace that doesn't seek permission. The kind of peace that quietly walks away from situations that no longer deserve its attention. And that is where the discomfort begins. Because for the first time, she realizes something she never had to consider before. What if you're actually gone? Not physically, emotionally. What if the man who always reached out no longer feels the need? What if the man who always tried to fix things has stopped trying? What if the man who always made space for her no longer rearranges his life around her moods? That's when uncertainty enters. And uncertainty is powerful. Because while attention creates comfort, absence creates awareness. Suddenly, she notices what she ignored. Your consistency, your patience, your loyalty, your presence. Things she once considered ordinary begin looking extraordinary. Not because they changed, because they're no longer available. The Stoics understood this deeply. Seneca once wrote that people often fail to appreciate what they possess until it disappears. Not because the thing changed, because perception changed. And perception controls value. The moment something is no longer guaranteed, its true worth becomes visible. That's why the greatest mistake a man can make is constantly advertising his value. Value rarely needs advertising. It reveals itself through absence, through contrast, through loss. And by the time many people recognize it, the opportunity to appreciate it has already passed. The moment she realizes you are gone. And here's the part nobody talks about. Most people think regret arrives immediately. They imagine the moment you walk away is the moment she suddenly understands everything she lost. But that's not how regret works. Regret is delayed. It's quiet. It's patient. And that's exactly why it's so powerful. Because when you leave, she still has distractions. She still has friends. Still has attention. Still has people telling her she's right. At first, nothing feels different. Life continues. Days pass. Weeks pass. Maybe even months. And during that time, she convinces herself she made the right choice. She tells herself you were too sensitive, too emotional, too available, too invested. She creates a story where walking away from you is necessary. And for a while, she believes it. But then something strange happens. Reality starts speaking louder than her excuses. Because eventually the attention fades. The distractions lose their shine. The temporary validation disappears. And that's when she starts comparing. Not intentionally, not consciously, but naturally. The new conversations don't feel as genuine. The new connections don't feel as safe. The new people don't show the same patience, the same loyalty, the same consistency. And suddenly she remembers. She remembers the way you showed up, the way you listened, the way you cared. The things she once overlooked become impossible to ignore. That's the cruel thing about value. People rarely understand it while they have it. They understand it after it's gone. Marcus Aurelius wrote that people often fail to appreciate what is right in front of them because familiarity blinds them. What becomes familiar becomes invisible, and what becomes invisible becomes undervalued. Until it's gone. Then suddenly it becomes unforgettable. Your absence becomes the lesson. The truth is, your presence never taught her your value. Your absence did. Because while you were there, she had constant access. She knew you would answer. She knew you would forgive. She knew you would understand. And because she knew it was always available, she stopped seeing how rare it actually was. This happens everywhere in life. People ignore healthy relationships. They overlook loyal friends. They take supportive family members for granted. Not because those people lack value, but because consistency creates comfort. And comfort often destroys appreciation. Until the consistency disappears. Then the silence becomes impossible to ignore. Your good morning messages stop. Your concern disappears. Your support vanishes. The emotional safety you provided is no longer there. And suddenly she notices the empty space. Not because you created it, because she finally sees what was filling it all along. That's why Stoicism teaches detachment. Not because attachment is wrong, but because your value should never depend on someone recognizing it. Your value exists whether they appreciate it or not. A diamond doesn't become less valuable because someone mistakes it for a rock. The power of becoming unreachable. There comes a moment in every man's journey when he stops seeking closure. And that's when real healing begins. Because closure isn't something another person gives you. Closure is something you create. Most men spend months waiting for explanations, waiting for apologies, waiting for accountability, waiting for that perfect conversation that finally makes everything make sense. But life rarely gives you that. Most people never apologize. Most people never admit what they did. Most people never acknowledge the damage they caused. And if your peace depends on their acknowledgement, you've handed them control over your future. Stoics understood this centuries ago. You cannot control another person's actions. You cannot control another person's awareness. You cannot control another person's regret. You can only control yourself, your response, your standards, your direction. And the moment you stop needing them to understand, you become free. Because now your happiness no longer depends on their realization. Your growth no longer depends on their apology. Your future no longer depends on their approval. And ironically, that's often when they finally notice. What truly creates regret? Most men think regret comes from making someone jealous. It doesn't. Jealousy fades. Regret lasts. And regret is created by contrast, not competition. The deepest regret happens when someone realizes they lost something they can no longer replace. Not because you became rich. Not because you became famous. Not because you found someone else. Because you became a version of yourself they never thought possible. A peaceful version. A disciplined version. A confident version. A fulfilled version. When she sees you thriving without resentment, that's when the comparison begins. Because she expected pain. She expected bitterness. She expected anger. Instead, she sees growth. And growth is impossible to argue with. Growth doesn't need validation. Growth doesn't need revenge. Growth simply exists. And that reality becomes impossible to ignore. The Stoic secret most men miss. Here's what most men misunderstand about strength. Strength is not becoming cold. Strength is not becoming emotionless. Strength is not pretending you never cared. That's not Stoicism. That's avoidance. Real Stoicism means feeling everything, without letting those feelings control your actions. You can miss someone and still move forward. You can love someone and still walk away. You can feel pain and still choose discipline. That's real power, because anyone can act strong when they feel nothing. The challenge is remaining strong when you feel everything. When your heart wants to reach out. When your mind wants answers. When your emotions want closure. And yet you choose dignity. You choose self-respect. You choose peace. Not because it's easy, because it's necessary. The final lesson. One day, you stop checking. You stop wondering. You stop replaying conversations in your head. You stop imagining different outcomes. You stop carrying the weight of someone else's choices. And when that day arrives, something incredible happens. You realize you won. Not against her. Against yourself. Against the insecurity that kept you chasing. Against the fear that kept you settling. Against the loneliness that made you accept less than you deserved. That is the victory. Not getting her back. Getting yourself back. Because at the end of the day, the greatest loss was never losing her. The greatest loss was losing yourself while trying to keep someone who wasn't willing to value you. And the greatest comeback isn't making her regret losing you. It's becoming a man who no longer needs anyone to regret anything. A man whose peace cannot be shaken. A man whose self-worth cannot be negotiated. A man who understands that respect begins the moment he stops abandoning himself. And when you become that man, something remarkable happens. Whether she regrets it or not. Whether she comes back or not. Whether she finally understands or not. It no longer matters. Because the life you were searching for in another person, you finally built within yourself. And that is the one thing nobody can ever take away from you.